Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the True Blue Crime podcast. This is the Superbike Murders Part 3. So, if you have not listened to the Superbike Murders Part 1 and 2, I would recommend going back and listening to those first, as this episode will be talking mainly about the suspect of those murders. So, listen to parts 1 and 2, which is actually episodes 2 and 3 of the podcast, and then listen to this one, and it'll make a lot more sense. So, just wanted to take a second and mention, if you haven't, please like and follow the True Blue Crime Productions Facebook page, and check out the website at truebluecrimeproductions.com. Also, I want to take a second to thank Jeff Thule for being my first of hopefully many Patreon supporters. Jeff jumped out at the highest level, and I appreciate that, Jeff. And please, if you can financially afford it, please support this podcast so I can keep making free episodes for people to enjoy. Speaking of free episodes for people to enjoy, checking the analytics for this podcast, I was able to see that all 3 of the first 3 episodes were downloaded and hopefully enjoyed by a person unknown in Brussels, Belgium. So whoever you are, thank you very much. You have made True Blue Crime Podcasts international at this point. And again, big thank you to all the listeners out there and everyone who's downloaded the episodes. And without further ado, we will get into episode 4 here. So just a quick recap, even though you guys did listen to episodes 2 and 3, I hope. We spoke in episode 2 about the Superbike murders themselves in Chesney, South Carolina, and then the 3 murder victims and the surviving victim in Woodruff, South Carolina. So just again, since these podcasts are more about remembering and honoring the victims of these crimes, I want to go through the names of the victims we'll be talking about here throughout the case. We have from the Superbike murders, we have the owner of the store, Scott Ponder, his mother, Beverly Guy, his best friend, Brian Lucas, and the shop's mechanic, Chris Sherbert. Then in Woodruff, South Carolina, the 3 homicide victims are Charlie Carver, Megan Coxey, and Johnny Coxey, and the survivor of this monster is Kayla Brown. So this episode is going to be fully dedicated to speaking about the suspect in these horrendous crimes. Identified him near the end of episode 3 there, part 2 of the Superbike murders, but I wanted to re-identify him here, and then we'll talk about him here shortly. So his name is Todd Kohlhepp, and he was 45 years old at the time of his arrest in 2016. And I will take a second to sidestep here and say I still stand fast by the fact I will not identify any episodes, name them, I should say, after a suspect, because I do not want to give them notoriety. I know that this episode kind of flies in the face of that, in regards to the fact that this entire episode is dedicated to talking about Todd, but I really feel there are times when someone is such a monster that they require a full episode to kind of break down what made them do what they did, and it kind of falls back on the age-old quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I know it's not a direct correlation to what we have going on here, but I do think, if we're not curious about what makes these people do things that are so antisocial, so against the norm of society, then I think we miss an opportunity to either potentially identify others that may do this, and as a result, we miss a chance to potentially save victims. And I think it's important to just break it down just on a knowledge basis for all of us to better understand kind of what happened and why it happened. So that being said, again, I am not trying to give Todd Kohlhepp any additional notoriety or fame or anything by speaking about him, but I just hope everyone can understand why I want to do some of these episodes when the suspect is as Kohlhepp is. So We're going to be speaking about Todd Kohlhepp. He was born on March 7th in 1971 in Florida. Spent most of his, I guess, younger childhood in Georgia and South Carolina. His parents did divorce when he was 2, and he was raised by his mother and stepfather. We'll discuss it later, but apparently there was a lot of issues between him and his stepfather at this time period. And to say that his childhood was troublesome, I think, is a bit of an understatement. Everything that I read showed that he was extremely aggressive towards other children, had issues forming social bonds with other children, and this kind of manifested by the time he was 9 years old. He was already being put into counseling. And this is, in the 70s. This is, was not even born yet. I was almost ready to be born, but from everything that I understood, the 70s and even kind of the 80s was not a time period in which there was kind of the widespread acceptance that there is of counseling now. The support for counseling, I guess, it wouldn't have been as high, especially for a 9-year-old. I think that was still kind of in a time period when you let kids be kids and they'll figure things out. So the fact that he was going through counseling at 9 due to his extreme anger and I guess by 9 he already had a fixation on sexual content. So there are some issues obviously going on there. We'll discuss it later, but he at one point shot a dog with a BB gun, and he killed a goldfish by pouring Clorox bleach in its bowl. So there is the famous McDonald triangle that some people say is a good indicator of future violent behavior, or it's often referred to as indicators of a potential serial killer. In this case, McDonald triangle is abuse towards animals, fire starting or fire play, and bedwetting. So I couldn't find anything in the research about issues with him bedwetting, but fire setting or fire play is linked to damage, and there were a lot of references to the fact that he liked to destroy other kids' stuff at school as he was growing up. So I would put that into the destructive behavior. It's clear that he had cruelty towards animals, and whether or not bedwetting was involved, I think we're going to see that he checked all the boxes for a dangerous future regarding his level of violence. So even his biological father, who was mostly out of the picture for most of his younger childhood, said that Kohlhepp only knew anger and madness. So at some point around this time period, I think he's in around 10, 11 years old, he spends 3.5 months in a mental institute. They're trying to develop his social skills and temper some of that aggression towards other children via he's inpatient in this mental hospital. But eventually he gets so out of control, he's damaging stuff in his mother's house, that she ships him off to live with his father in Tempe, Arizona. So this is 1983. He's 12 years old. He's now living with his father. And as we're going to find out, his father is not exactly a great father figure either. His father claimed to have been a special forces operative in Vietnam, that he knew a ton of stuff about weapons and explosives, and according to Kohlhepp, his father taught him a lot of stuff about firearms and explosives, and that seemed to be the only bond that they shared. Now, Kohlhepp would later claim that his father wasn't really around much anyway, that his father was spending time with up to 30 different women, abandoning Kohlhepp on his own for days at a time. And so if we look back, since school age up into his early teens, all of his formative years, Kohlhepp is acting out aggressively. He's having major issues with attachments, and now the only adult in his life is teaching him about firearms and explosives, and then continuing to abandon him. So this is all going to kind of come to a head on November 25th of 1986. He's now 15 years old, and he makes the decision to kidnap a 14-year-old neighbor girl in Tempe, Arizona, in his father's neighborhood there. So he gets one of his father's .22 caliber revolvers, went over to this girl. Now, this girl was a friend of his, I guess, an acquaintance, and it later was stated that he spent quite a bit of time with her just as a friend, but he was upset because he liked this girl, and she didn't like him back that way. She had crushes on some of his other friends, so he felt she rejected him. He, on this day, decides he's going to go over to her house. He surprises her and threatens her with this gun, brings her to his father's house where he binds her, tapes her mouth shut, and then rapes her. He says afterwards he walks her home, but threatened her that if she told anyone, he would kill her entire family. She does end up reporting this incident, and the police show up to Kohlhepp's father's home. I read later on that when the police showed up, he stepped outside with the gun and put it to his temple and pulled the trigger, but he claimed the gun jammed. I couldn't find any corresponding police reports to say whether or not this was the case, but this is what he told somebody later on, and that he made the claim that someone clearly wanted him to live. He had a higher purpose because of that incident. But so as a result of this kidnapping and rape incident, he pleads guilty in 1987 to the kidnapping charge, but the other charges were dropped. So the sexual assault and the weapons charges were dropped. Despite the fact he's only facing the kidnapping charge, he does get sentenced to 15 years in prison and is required to register as a sex offender. It's at this point, he's 16, 17 years old, he goes through a pretty extensive psychological exam. I was able to find this exam online, and the documents show that he clearly had a lot of issues going on inside his head, and almost all of them centered around the fact that he's prone to extreme anger and has issues with acceptance and attachment to others. So kind of all of the things that as he grew up, I don't think he ever felt like he was wanted after his parents' divorce, and he lashed out at other children, which of course would drive them away, which would then become a self-fulfilling prophecy for him that kids didn't like him or didn't want to be around him, and that it would cause him to get angry and destroy their stuff, which then just furthered the cycle there. So as he's going through his formative years, he's having all these experiences with anger and acting out towards other children, and it doesn't appear that the counseling or the time in the mental institute helped him at all. But they're gonna diagnose him with borderline personality disorder, and in this case, they also checked his IQ, and he had an average IQ of 118. So he's not developmentally delayed to the point that he doesn't understand what's going on around him, but he's also not one of the rare cases where they're extremely intelligent but don't understand their actions around them. So unfortunately, while he is going to serve 15 years or serve a total of 14 years, for this rape and kidnapping, he's going to serve these years while he's 16 years old to 30 years old. So again, he doesn't have much of a childhood to look back on and have much positive coming from it, and then he's sent to prison, rightfully so, but sent to prison at 16 years old. So now, during again another very important time period in one's life where they're becoming an adult and learning to become responsible for their actions or whatnot, he's spending that entire time in prison. So he's going to be released into society in 2001, and I will mention that while he was in prison, he managed to graduate from college with a degree in computer science. So he had told the psychologist that did his exam back when he was 15 years old that while he enjoyed reading, he didn't really like school, but he liked putting stuff together and thought he was pretty good at it. So it does seem like he had a knack for engineering or building things, and it does seem like he had clearly enough intelligence to get a bachelor's degree, graduate college, and in a science type environment. So he's going to get hired as a graphic designer in 2002 and work at a company between 2002 and November 2003 as he's working as a graphic designer for a company in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So I looked at the map, and Spartanburg, South Carolina is about 16 miles from Chesney, South Carolina, where the Superbike Motors shop is. So that's going to tie him into Superbike Murders. So we're going to go back they're going to stick in 2003 here. I believe, I didn't find exact dates or years, but I'm just going to go with the idea that a lot of this stuff happened in around that time period. So prior to the murders, sometime around 2003, Kohlhepp purchases a motorcycle, a sport bike from Superbike Motorsports. Now, it's said that he probably purchased too powerful of a sport bike for somebody who has never ridden a motorcycle before. And according to him, he claims he was talked into it, but he does have a problem with telling the truth about situations. He'll tell partial truths that take the blame off of him. So, but he blamed Superbike Motorsports for selling him a bike that was too powerful. But they end up delivering this bike to the parking lot where he's living. I'm assuming some type of apartment complex or something. And he takes it out for a ride, ends up crashing it. And he claims he tried to return the motorcycle because he had, it was too powerful for him, or whatever the case may be. He didn't know how to ride it. And he claims that the staff there laughed at him and told him it was his now and they weren't going to take it back. He says it's just a matter of weeks before the motorcycle is then stolen, and he files an insurance claim against the stolen motorcycle, and he ends up having to pay a $1,000 deductible. Now, I don't know for a fact that the bike was actually ever stolen. This is what he's claiming happened. It's possible he sold the bike somehow and put an insurance claim out against it. I don't know. There was no record of the bike ever being located. I mean, bikes do have VINs and titles and all that stuff, so I have to imagine that the bike would have resurfaced at some point. But regardless, he claims this incident left a sour taste in his mouth in regards to the whole ordeal. However, he started going back to college for another degree, and he decided he wanted a motorcycle to ride to college for whatever reason. So even despite the fact that he had this bad encounter with this motorcycle shop, he decides he's going to go back there and try to buy another motorcycle. He claims when he gets back to the shop to buy the motorcycle, one of the employees made some implication that they were involved in the theft of his motorcycle, which upsets him and he leaves the store. But he does claim he goes back several times after that even to sit on different bikes as he's still thinking about buying one of them, but believes that the staff is talking trash about him as he's sitting on these bikes. So eventually he's had enough. He gets enraged, goes and buys a 9mm Beretta with 10-round magazines, with 3 10-round magazines, and then on a Thursday after class, he drives his vehicle to the Superbikes Motorsports, where he waits until all 4 staff members arrive. He said he had been sitting on a black Kawasaki Katana 600 motorcycle and was talking with staff about the motorcycle and eventually told the staff that he would buy it. At this point, Chris the mechanic takes the motorcycle back to the rear of the shop to prep the motorcycle for the sale, and the last customer we mentioned in part 1 makes his purchase and leaves, at which point Kohlhepp walks to the back of the store where Chris is working on the motorcycle, pulls out the gun, shoots Chris twice, and then Kohlhepp begins walking back towards the front of the store. He states that Beverly Guy and Brian and Scott have gathered in the hallway between kind of the front of the store and the rear of the store, back where Beverly Guy's kind of office and the bathrooms are, and he shoots Beverly Guy, which causes Scott and Brian to run to the front door, at which point he shoots at both of them, doing what he calls a tactical reload in the middle of this in the middle of the shooting. He then walks up to Scott and Brian, shoots each of them in the forehead, walks back into the store, stands over Beverly, shoots her in the forehead, walks back, and shoots Chris in the forehead. He then leaves the store, disposing of the gun after leaving. So not much is known about Kohlhepp's actions between the Superbike murders, and nothing really pops up on the radar in his life until 2006, at which point people notice that he files for a realtor's license. He falsifies his application because you can't be a felon and have a realtor's license. So he falsifies his application and gets his realtor license in 2006. He builds a successful real estate practice, employing up to 10 other agents at one point. However, he's got a successful business practice, but socially he's still causing a lot of issues. There was a lot of reports from female work associates of him being sexually inappropriate, also being at times angry and condescending towards his coworkers, and then that he liked to talk about firearms a lot, and that he would often watch pornography while in his office at work. So he's still showing some antisocial behavior, antisocial tendencies, but for the most part, he's actually built a successful business and is making decent money at this point. So in 2014, he buys the 95-acre property in Woodruff for just over $300,000, but then he spends an additional $80,000 on a fence that runs around most of the property. At this time, he's also visiting the local Waffle Houses, and this is where he meets Megan Coxey. And if you remember from part 2 of this series, Kohlhepp would approach or would entice female employees of this Waffle House with large tips, trying to get them to come home with him. This again falls back likely on his issues with rejection and anger issues in regards to not being attractive or feeling like he's attractive. So it's believed that his invitation to Megan and Johnny to his property was in order for him to fulfill the desire that he had with Megan Coxey as a waitress at this store, and bringing her to his house. Now, I did report in part 2 that I wasn't sure if Megan or had been shot right away with Johnny. Further research for this episode did reveal somehow they believe that the couple was reported missing on December 22nd, and that was shortly after Megan was last heard from in a jail call asking for bail. However, they believe Johnny was killed somewhere around that time, and Megan lived for a week after Johnny. So it is very possible that the Megan and Johnny situation was very similar to the Charles and Kayla situation, where Johnny was shot in front of Megan, and then Megan was subjected to likely to rape and captivity for at least a week, and then possibly killed when either she fought back or tried to escape or something along those lines. So just again, sometimes when you're doing research for one episode, in a 3-part episode like this, you'll find the one article or the one reference to that answers a question from a different episode. So basically, so that's late 2015, early 2016. He has now made this property. Now, he claimed to investigators afterwards that this property was supposed to be his quote-unquote paradise, and it was not supposed to be a killing fields situation. However, many investigators do believe that this property was purchased and the fence was put up and everything in an effort for him to build kind of the perfect environment for him to do exactly what he ended up doing, which was kidnapping women, keeping them there to fulfill his sexual desires, and killing them and burying them without anyone finding out. So while he claims one thing, it seems pretty obvious to everybody else that this was all part of a grander plan that he had. So we now get into 2016. On August 31st, he hires Charles and Kayla to work on his property. We discussed what happened. He shot Charles 3 times in the chest and detains Kayla in a container for 2 months. On November 3rd, he's arrested after Kayla is found on his property. So I read one spot that he was put under pretty lengthy interrogation by officers. Other places seem to make it sound like he was more willing to talk, but eventually I guess he told investigators that if he could talk to his mother and tell her what he had done before she found out from either the police or the news, then he would be willing to confess to everything. So arrangements were made for Kohlhepp's mother to come to the police station. He met with her, told her, confessed to everything to her, gave her a photo and information about putting some money into a friend's child's college savings fund, and then agreed to confess to officers. Now, some of the stuff that he confessed to officers was released, and some of the stuff that he confessed to his mother was released. Apparently, he told his mother that he killed a lot more than 7 people. When she asked him how many, he said, "You don't have enough fingers." So I don't know if she was, holding up fingers to try to get him to indicate how many. But we know of 7. He's claiming it's over 10. The only thing he told police in regards to additional murders was that he claimed he shot someone in Arizona. I wouldn't give him a time frame, so Tempe police did look at unsolved homicides from the 80s when he was there, and then also for the short time period he lived there after being released from prison, and they weren't able to find anything that matched up. But that doesn't mean that he didn't kill a homeless person that was never reported, or a missing person from a different city, something along those lines. So it is unknown whether or not Todd did kill someone in Tempe, Arizona. He was also looked at for that bank robbery I think I mentioned very briefly in part 1, and it's a case I might cover at some point, and then I'll be referencing some of this stuff. But basically it's a triple homicide bank robbery in Greer, South Carolina, and just based on the level of violence used and the lack of decency towards human life, and Todd's claims that he killed more than 10 people, if you add the 3 in Greer, South Carolina, and the 1 that he claims he killed in Tempe, Arizona, that would put you at 11, which would be more than 10, so he would not be lying. However, when asked about this, he denied any involvement, which seems strange because he was willing to admit to the murders that the evidence pointed towards him involved in with and that he had told Kayla that he had done. But when he was approached about this bank robbery, this triple homicide bank robbery, he denied any involvement, and he definitely seems to have been cooperative about the things that he did, but at the same time he also seemed to like to play games. So it's unknown. That case still remains unsolved, which, like I said, might cover it at some point down the road here. But this is again where we'll mention what we talked about in part 2, the false confessions. The information here that was not made to the public was the fact that each victim had been shot in the forehead in an execution style. So only the crime scene investigators, the investigators themselves, and anybody who was there that day in 2003 would have known that the victims were shot an additional time in the forehead. And this was something that Todd, not only confessed to but bragged about. So that, and the fact that he was on the list of customers for the Superbike motors, and that there was a record of him buying that motorcycle, so that story checks out. All of that leads me to believe that police were 100% confident that he was responsible for the Superbike murders. And the fact he was able to locate the bodies of Charles, and the fact that Kayla told police that he killed Charles, and the fact he was able to locate the bodies of Johnny and Megan Coxey, I think police are, and the fact the bodies were on his property, police are pretty confident that he is rightfully confessing to those murders as well. So he is known to have done 7 murders, but there are many people that believe that he murdered more people, and that there may be more people buried on his property, because again, he purchased that in 2014, and even if the fence took a little bit to put up, he's got, in a matter of a couple years, he's already killed 3 people with plans to kill the 4th and bury them on the property, and there wasn't really anybody stopping him from doing so. So many believe there may have been other victims between the Coxeys and Charles and Kayla, but at this point there's no proof of it. I know he did tell a newspaper that he had committed several more murders, but again, nobody at this point can verify that. So just to finish up with kind of an ending to this story before we kind of break down and analyze his life to a certain degree. On May 26, 2017, Kohlhepp pled guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So he will never, ever be free again, and this plea took the death penalty off the table. So I hear a lot of true crime podcasters that bring up the death penalty in their discussions, and just as podcasters represent Americans in general, I think you find a split amongst podcasters like you would find a split amongst the general population. I understand both sides of the arguments, and having been a law enforcement officer, it doesn't necessarily lead me to believe that one path is better than the other. However, I will say that there are a lot of cases where the death penalty, or I should say the threat of the death penalty, is enough to prevent someone from trying to escape justice via a trial. And the reason I say that is, in any death penalty case, the reason the death penalty is even available is usually because of the heinous nature of the crimes, whether it be the age of the victims, the actions taken by the perpetrator upon the victims, the number of victims, whatever it may be. It's usually the death penalty, as far as I can tell, is reserved for the most egregious cases, and those are the cases that I believe likely affect the most amount of people, and whether that be because of the number of victims or what I went through, the age of victims, whatever it may be. Trials, people don't always realize how absolutely damaging trials can be to the victims. And I don't mean that just from the standpoint of it's hard for them to relive these experiences, which is one of the main reasons why it's so difficult, the trials are so difficult on the victims, but I mean it because trials last forever. I mean, some of my cases, even if the investigation took 6 months to a year, the actual process of the trial was sometimes years, and that included a lot of subpoenas to appear, where whether you're a police officer or in the case of the victims, the family or whatnot, you take off time, you find somebody to watch your kids, whatever it may be, because you don't want to miss this court date, or you can't miss this court date because it's a crime to do so. And a day before that court date, the whole thing gets moved back another month or two. And this will happen countless number of times as I said, for a period of up to a year, 2 years, sometimes longer. And it just drains these families of these victims, and it drains everybody else involved. The only one person that benefits to a certain degree, I guess, is the criminals. That, you know, it just delays justice, and most of them, if it's going to a trial, are likely going to continue to stay in jail, so they're not risking much by continuing these trials. So that's just kind of a sidebar on the fact that when you have these really heinous crimes, the last thing the family needs to do is sit through a 2, 3, 4 week trial as they listen to crime scene technicians break down and show photos of what the crime scene looked like, photos of their loved ones with horrible injuries or deformities or whatever it may be. And then often cases, as like this one, the prosecution would have likely called Kayla to the stand, and if not, the defense would have called Kayla to the stand. And these defense attorneys with Kayla on the stand would have just attacked her, and not only would she have to relive everything that she went through while she sits, 15, 20 feet away from the man that did this to her for 2 months. Everything about her life is going to be brought into question by these defense attorneys to try to create some little angle of, doubt in the jury towards towards Cole Epps' guilt here. So avoiding a trial if possible is always the best way. I mean, sometimes plea agreements don't work out in the favor of the family or the victims. They feel that the suspect gets off too leniently, but in this case, 7 consecutive life sentences. He's not going to see the outside of a prison in his lifetime. So to avoid putting everybody through that trial, and he wants to avoid the death penalty, it's one of the reasons why I'm a proponent for the death penalty. Again, I can understand some of the arguments against it. I'm not standing up here on a pulpit holding signs supporting the death penalty by any means, but it's just one of the reasons for the death penalty that I think needs to be considered when you're bringing up the argument. So as we wrap up this episode, I know I just wanted to take a second and just reiterate the fact that just because I talked so much about Cole Epps' childhood and some of the stuff that he had to deal with in terms of his childhood, I don't by any means take away any of the responsibility that he has towards what he did. He is a kind of a difficult guy to place into the spectrum of psychological disorders. I know the one psychiatrist, and I'm by no means a psychiatrist, so I'm not trying to diagnose him, but I'm just saying he doesn't fit the mold of a lot of the severe mental disorders in terms of, yes, he has borderline personality disorder traits, but he also has shown remorse for what he did, which kind of separates him, I guess, from a lot of these other killers that share some of his mental issues. It definitely seems as if he was so obsessed with being wanted or being a part of something else, being attached to something, and with everything that he went through growing up, that combined with his obsession with violence and firearms and whatnot, he just kind of morphed into this adult that, while he could function in society, he was a successful businessman. He just could not handle situations that drove him to extreme rage, and he just reacted in ways that are almost ununderstandable by anybody else. So So again, he's kind of an anomaly when it comes to these types of killers. He's a very interesting case study, I'm sure, for psychologists and whatnot. But the important thing here is that, we remember the young lives that were cut short by someone who just is nothing short of a monster. And one of the few positives we can take from this, besides the fact that Kayla was able to survive, is that he wasn't able to continue to victimize other people using that property. And just before I end here, I guess I forgot to go back and mention, police did look, after he was arrested, police kind of looked through, I'm guessing during some of their computer forensics, looking for some of that Facebook information and whatnot. They did look through his, I'm guessing his computer, and found some online profiles for Amazon where he rated several products, and just a glimpse into his mind is he rated for a fixed blade knife. He said he hasn't stabbed anyone yet, yet, but I'm keeping the dream alive, and when I do, it will be with a quality tool like this. For a entrenching tool, which is a foldable shovel, he rated it 5 stars and said, keep in your car for when you have to hide the bodies and you left the full-size shovel at home. Does not come with a midget, which would have been nice. And then a final one, he rated a master padlock with 5 stars, giving it solid locks, have 5 on a shipping container, won't stop them, but sure will slow them down if they are too old to care. So this is a guy that inside of his brain he had a lot of morbid and dark thoughts going on, and unfortunately they manifested at least 4 times if you count the poor young girl in Tempe, Arizona, but they manifest at least 4 times that we know of, and I would not be surprised if investigators are able to locate further victims at some point from this monster. So that is a wrap on the Superbike murders, all 3 parts. I appreciate everybody sticking around and listening to all 3 episodes. I will probably be picking a slightly less complicated episode for the next case, but I hope to have it out in the next couple days. And again, please like and follow on Facebook, contribute to Patreon if you can, and until next time, appreciate it, guys. Take care. Bye.